Welcome to the Speakings podcast. My name is Sandra. I'm a writer and philosopher in training, as I'm currently a PhD student. And in these episodes, I speak about philosophical and spiritual topics in a mainly unscripted way, as I hope to capture some of the dynamism of thought that philosophers have to really wrestle with each idea, taking them seriously. And I hope you do the same as I present these ideas to you. You can leave reviews or email me to let me know what you think. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy. It feels like there's been some resistance or duality battling inside. I say inside, but it seems like the more directly I deal with my own experience, the less conceptual I become, the more the interior-exterior divide is revealed to be something conceptual, something that happens in thought after the fact of experience. So I'm not sure if it's interior. Often I think that I'm having a particular emotion, and then there's a realization, this isn't necessarily my emotion. It seems like maybe I'm picking up on something that is in the atmosphere, in the environment, in the person that is across from me. And then eventually you start wondering if there are persons or environments at all, or if it's all one big thing. Okay, that was kind of psychedelic non-duality there, but there does seem to be this increasing non-duality as you get closer and closer to experience. And at the moment, there is this feeling of a kind of interior resistance, this friction, wanting to deny something or resist something that is occurring. And there's a part of me that wants to interpret it on a personal level, and I can find certain justifications for interpreting that way. I'm about to start the semester again, where I have a lot more responsibilities. There might be some stress involved with that, which is creating some of this friction, a feeling of I have to take care of myself, I have to be more ruthless in terms of getting things done. But I think there's just as much justification for interpreting this experience as being an external friction, an external resistance. Donald Trump was inaugurated this week as president of the United States for the second time, both, I guess. And I'm at a loss. I mean, I don't think that anyone who's taking this moment seriously from a historical or philosophical perspective can really wrap their minds around it fully, because he has pushed the boundaries of sanity so far, the boundaries of hate. And the response to that is feeling stunned. And by stunned, I mean immobilized, like I've just been hit by a stun gun. I think a lot of people are feeling that way, even if they're not acknowledging it explicitly. It seems like some of us have this feeling both of being arrested and also this feeling of wanting to strive towards something. So both not knowing how to act and feeling immobilized, and a feeling of, how can I resist this? Whether that's running to another country, burying oneself in work, burying oneself in entertainment so as not to think about it, or perhaps political resistance. I think the people who are actually resisting politically are a very, very small sliver of Americans, unfortunately. I think that we've all been intellectually sterilized. I don't want to say euthanized because that's too strong of a word, but at the very least, we're all taking the soma in Huxley's Brave New World, this drug that puts one into this, not even a state of happiness, but a kind of flatness, a flat affect, which you get from the flatness of screens, the flatness of dull entertainment with the same old storylines, right? And I think this is where we are as a culture and as a society, that we've entertained ourselves into a collective sleep. So very few of us are acting politically. And what often happens is that there's an illusion of political action, that we think that reposting a meme or reposting a funny video is in fact political resistance when it's not. I do this too. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, sort of. I'm not good at either of them. I'm not good at social media. Maybe someday I'll become better at it. I haven't figured out how to have an authentic relationship with social media, so it frustrates me. because I do see how mindless it is and how it encourages the fragmentation of our attention in this attention economy, which is based on fragmenting and selling units of our attention to advertisers. This is a problem that leads us to live morally and intellectually impoverished lives in which we are constantly anxious but never fulfilled. That being said, I struggle to know how to create or communicate on social media in a way that can wake people up when the goal of the app seems to be to put us to sleep so that we can scroll for longer and longer and our attention can be redirected more easily. Because, of course, an autonomous agent is not an agent that can be manipulated by economic algorithms or political algorithms. So where is this resistance coming from and where can it go? I want to distinguish here different meanings of the word resistance because in a non-dual context, which has influenced my language and my thinking in some ways because I try to stay close to experience, which is inherently non-dual, resistance has a negative valence. Resistance is the source of suffering. And that meaning of the word resistance is something like denial. It's denying what is present. So the experience of pain is not in itself an experience of suffering. Suffering ensues when we resist the pain, putting a thought between the self and the pain, putting an interpretation between the self and the pain, putting a preference between the self and the pain. This is what creates suffering. So basically, suffering is a consequence of distance. And the self is that which generates distance and is itself a product of that distance. I don't know how the self originates. No one, I'm willing to say, knows how the self originates. This is a mystery because we are already instituted into selfhood, language, interpretation once we begin trying to interpret the origin of the self. Now, of course, we can find this experientially where the self originates from things like shame, etc., but there's no hard beginning, just like there's no beginning of the universe. Such a beginning would be impossible. Not to get into theoretical physics with you here, but even the Big Bang doesn't describe the beginning of the universe. It describes the beginning of the universe a couple, less than milliseconds after the universe has already started. There's no something from nothing. There's no origin and there's no end. I know we're getting really psychedelic again, but this is just not possible for human thought to fathom a beginning or an end because it doesn't occur in experience. There's no such thing as a hard beginning or a hard end in direct experience. So when we talk about something like pain, it in itself is not a problem. The self in itself is not a problem. The problem is the distancing and the resistance. So resistance takes on this negative connotation because it's about denying something that is present. It's basically a form of ignorance because denying something doesn't make it go away. Denying something doesn't change reality. It just changes your relationship to reality. So resistance is a certain relationship to reality that creates suffering. It doesn't change reality. Again, it's a delusion. It's ignorance. You could say it's both unethical and irrational because it predates those distinctions. And you find this is the same in the political sphere, that the unethical is always also the irrational. We often speak of intelligence as if it were just a product of IQ or just a product of a particular type of brain structure or the strength of neuronal connections in the brain. And in that way, we can talk about Elon Musk as being a very intelligent person, but in fact, he is greatly lacking in intelligence in a more expansive definition, which includes connection to and intimacy with truth on a more fundamental level, which includes emotional openness, all of these things, which includes right ethical relations. All of these things are forms of intelligence, and you can't have one truly without the other elements, or you can't have one fully without the other elements being present. So how do we resist in a way that does not reinforce the denial of reality that is the root of suffering, let's say? Because political resistance doesn't have to have a negative connotation. I'm a big fan, for example, of nonviolent resistance movements that are described in books like Jesus and the Disinherited, Jesus and Nonviolence, A Third Way, I think it's called, by Walter Wink. I'll put links in the show notes. And Martin Luther King, obviously, amazing advocate of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi, there's other theorists of nonviolent resistance that write about this in a way that is really fascinating. Nonviolent resistance is not just about rejecting violence, though of course that's part of it, but it's about trying to resist in such a way that we don't re-entrench evil. Because what typically happens when we resist another person, and we've all seen this in an argument, right? It's not about winning an argument. As long as you're in that mindset of winning and losing, you're always going to lose. Because the person that you're speaking with, when you challenge them on certain facts, or you challenge them on certain realities, or you challenge them even to open their heart, if they're clearly acting from a place of hatred or fear, when you challenge them from a place of wanting to be right and wanting to win an argument, it almost always causes them to reinforce their boundaries of the ego, which thrives on its identification with beliefs and with the need to be right. So this becomes really, really difficult. In fact, if you are very politically active, you've probably seen this. Even if you're not politically active, I'm sure you've seen it online, that two forces resisting each other tend to just reinforce their mutual resistance, tends to reinforce the duality. What is the solution to this? Nonviolent resistance tries to think of creative means to subvert this tendency to reinforce duality and to kind of trick the other person in a playful way to fall back on themselves and understand what they're doing. And it really does require almost an attitude of playfulness, an attitude of humor in some cases, and an attitude of openness. If you're into archetypes, it's kind of like a trickster energy, a way to make the so-called enemy see themselves, see the way that they're acting, reflect back their actions or their biases. And often the most effective way to do that, or at least the beginning point of mirroring the other person back, is to create a safe space for them. Now, what do I mean by creating a safe space for hatred? This is really difficult because sometimes creating a safe space, actually often creating a safe space, requires creating firm boundaries. I've had political or religious conversations with people in which I've been struck by the feeling that they are toddlers and that I need to treat them as toddlers. And I do not mean in a condescending way, because I had never even treated my own daughter in a condescending way. I always treated her as a spiritual equal, just with a relative distinction in age and experience. And so I would treat other people in these conversations in the same way, which sometimes means in the case of a toddler, for example, that is throwing a tantrum, a lot of parents don't understand this about children who are throwing tantrums. A lot of parents either shut them down immediately and say, you're not allowed to act that way, you're not allowed to have these feelings, etc. Or they kind of go the other route and say, okay, you can have these feelings and therefore you can act this way. To me, there is very clearly no necessary link between feelings and actions. So I've always told my daughter, there's nothing scary about your feelings. There's nothing bad about your feelings. Feelings are completely neutral. They're just here. They just want to be felt. Feel them, let them go. They come, they go. They're not here to stay. There's nothing dangerous about this feeling. In fact, I think it's when we make this false equation between feelings and actions that we develop these harmful reactions to our feelings. Like we think that anger will necessarily lead to us punching another person in the face, when in fact it's a refusal to feel that anger that leads us to externalize that feeling into an action, like punching someone in the face. I can't deal with this, I need an outlet, and so the outlet is punching someone, right? if I wasn't afraid of that anger because I didn't think it was inherently scary, if I was able to feel it fully myself without externalizing it, then it wouldn't be a danger to other people. So conflating these two, the actions and the emotions, is, I think, very harmful. You can feel something fully and then choose freely whether or not to act on it. You can feel your pain completely and keep running if you're an athlete. You can feel your boredom completely and keep meditating. You can feel your resistance completely and keep writing a paper. That's something that I really struggle with. Feeling fully, in fact, enables you to make a freer decision that is not necessarily going to occur because of that feeling. So I think that's part of it, is decoupling these two things. And part of allowing people a safe space to feel is creating boundaries, is saying, okay, you're not allowed to talk like that. You're not going to use this kind of language, or you're not going to speak in this way. And then within those boundaries, allowing certain things to be said. And more importantly, not focusing on what is said. This is so, so important. What is said is always derivative. What is felt is always primary. And whenever there's someone that is spewing hateful rhetoric, there's always a deeper wound there. I'm not saying it's your job to deal with that person's wounds. It's not. But if you want to create real political change, I do think this is something that we have to take seriously, not to try to fix people, not to try to make them feel better. Absolutely not. This is not like a pandering sentimentality here. This is like real pragmatic political action that occurs in our interpersonal relationships. And it occurs when we are able to meet that person without running. When you're able to meet that person without withdrawing, and you can feel it energetically, you can feel it emotionally, however you want to describe it, psychologically, without withdrawing from the situation. Right? So let's say someone is a big pro-Trumper and they're spewing all kinds of misinformation, or they're saying really transphobic or really racist things. Now you can start by saying, okay, there's certain boundaries we're going to have in this conversation. I'm not going to allow you to speak that way, in this way, whatever. Set your boundaries. You know what those boundaries are. Be truthful with yourself. Be truthful with the other person. And this, in fact, it doesn't just allow the other person to keep themselves safe. It also allows you to not withdraw into resentment and further hatred. So it also protects your heart. These boundaries are what allows your heart to remain open. And then as they speak, feel what they're saying. Feel it completely. Because what they're doing is they're running from their own feelings. They're running from their own fear. They're running from their own sense that maybe their life is not important. And so they need to attach to this bigger cause that maybe their past or their identity is not being taken seriously. So they need to fight to protect it, right? So these are emotions that they are running from and that are being hijacked and manipulated and preyed upon by ideologies. And what you can do is sit with them so fully and give them such a safe space to feel those emotions without affirming the ideology that is attached to those emotions, right? Again, I'm not saying be permissive with them. Again, back to the parenting analogy. I always tell my daughter, it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. However, it's not okay to give that feeling to someone else by externalizing it into another emotion. It's okay for me to feel stressed and sad and whatever while I'm PMSing. It's not okay for me to externalize that into snappiness and anger towards my partner. In the same way, it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. It's not okay to take it out on trans people or on immigrants, right? And this doesn't even have to do with a particular policy necessarily. Of course, that stems from it. But the root issue is a total lack of compassion. It's fear of compassion. I've heard this from certain conservatives. Oh, don't let those liberals convince you that compassion is more important than truth. These two things are not in contradiction, okay? Compassion and truth, these are not two separate entities. There's space here for all of that. And it starts with opening our hearts. And again, This is not some sentimental advice to love and light, forgiveness. It's actually the opposite. Because what I'm saying here is so much more radical and so much more difficult. It's only in embracing the darkness of yourself and thus the person that you're speaking with. Only in realizing that that darkness is at its root something totally harmless. It only becomes evil through resistance. In opening our hearts, we open our minds. And it's not easy. And sometimes it requires calling people out in a way that can be quite harsh. It's not all love and light and forgiveness, not the way that these things are traditionally defined. In fact, it's embracing the hatred, embracing the darkness, embracing the refusal to forgive, embracing all of these emotions, embracing all of these things until we get to the root, the fear at the root of all of these, the defense mechanisms, the trying to keep the world apart from each other. It's scary to be a human being. It's scary to be alive. Most of us were never allowed to feel that fear without trying to create beliefs and identities around it, without trying to externalize it and say, oh, it's the immigrants that are scary. It's the gay people that are trying to destroy my values and undermine America. The monsters within are the monsters without. The ego structures within are the ego structures without. So political healing is always personal healing and vice versa. There are sides that always focus on one, sides that always focus on the other. They're all holy. They're all real. They're all essential and necessary for collective healing. The spiritual is the intellectual. The psychological is the physical, right? Again, we speak, and speech necessarily demands such dualities, so I parse these categories as I see fit within the conversation. I'm not denying those categories as useful intellectual tools. But the truth is, reality arrives as one. It always arrives as one. And we need to remember that these are categories that we're splitting into. So to really resist politically, you need to address the personal and the interpersonal. You need to address your own relationships. How are you resisting? How are you causing resistance to reinforce itself? Or how are you healing by accepting and embracing the other? And we can't stop at the personal. I'm so frustrated with New Age movements that focus only on the individual, because this is such a side effect of American neoliberal capitalist ideology. If we only focus on the individual, political resistance is impossible, and also our empathy is just amputated. We have no idea what it means to belong to community. I want to fight for my community. I want to be political insofar as the political is necessary and the political is helpful, right? So this doesn't always mean acting on a national level. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it means acting on a local level. Usually the local is where our resources are much better utilized. Emotional, time, money, resources, whatever they are. So I do recommend local action over national action. But we have to continuously be capable of switching modalities, realizing the personal and the political and vice versa. Don't get caught in one or the other. Eventually you stop seeing the distinction between self and other, and you start seeing, okay, the oppression of any group of people is an oppression of me, of my own possibilities, of my own flourishing. There is no distinction, and that's where the heart starts breaking open, because that's a terrible place to be. There's a lot of grief there, and that grief needs to be felt. That grief needs to be felt of, it's only been me I've been harming all along. Even if you're one of the, quote unquote woke ones, even if you're the one that tries to be on the right side of history, we are still constantly and consistently looking out for ourselves primarily, and often in ways that are harming other people. To open the mind is always to open the heart. Break your heart open, and your mind will break open in a way that will allow you to move with greater flexibility and ease through the rigid landscape of ideologies that we have inherited. Between every American body, between every American mind, between every human body, between every human mind, there is a knowing that we are all fundamentally the same. Not in our differences, in our relative differences, those should be respected. But paradoxically, I think they're best respected when we trust the underlying unity. Because we know that these differences, this diversity is not a threat to unity. In fact, it reflects a trust in that unity. This is how I feel when I go to New York City. I'm about an hour from the city and we go fairly often. It's a place of such immense diversity. I don't just mean diversity of skin color, but diversity of belief, diversity of expression. That just to be in that environment where there's a cacophony of languages, a cacophony of beliefs, a cacophony of interior worlds, is to realize the absurdity of thinking that there's anything different between these diverse expressions of being. In fact, it's in the diversity that unity is most visible. But we can sense it even with people that we think are evil. The reason why we are frustrated is because there's a grief there. There's a grief because we see ourselves in them. We see ourselves in what they're doing. We see ourselves in their delusion. A grief that is beautiful and that is healing and is not negative in any sense of the word. In our country, in our time, in our place, we've learned to demonize certain emotions, and grief is one of them. Sadness is one of them. Anything dark is one of them. These emotions are the stuff of beauty. They're not bad. I mean, they're no more beautiful than emotions like joy or love, but they are necessary. And if they're here to be loved. They're here to be embraced. So if we're going to heal the world, we're going to have to start with that. Grief. And it will rise and we'll feel it and it will go again. And there will be hope. And that will rise and we'll feel it and we'll go again. And there will be something else. And that's okay. The point is to not resist the changes. And the more we embrace instead of resist, the more empowered we'll be to resist politically. You can resist from a place of oneness. And it's necessary that we do so. I would love to hear your thoughts on this and how you all are feeling. Thank you for listening.